Now welcome to another lightning response video, where this time the question comes to us from Sean Murphy, who asked, "Hey Thor, what is the point of departure from Star Wars? When is a work of fiction, ostensibly in the Star Wars setting franchise, no longer Star Wars? Is it simply enough to stamp Star Wars on the title and use some of the unique proper nouns of the setting, the Force, Jedi, Wookiee, Tatooine, etc., and that's good enough, it counts? I had this feeling watching Andor. Do a Control-H, find and replace on the proper nouns in that show's screenplay, and you could set it in any sci-fi setting with an evil empire. There are sure more than a few. So as installments go further and further afield from George Lucas's framing concepts of Star Wars, when do they stop being Star Wars and just become generic space fantasy? Thanks, love your channel." And I think this is a great and rather tricky question to answer, because it really kind of boils down to, do you think of Star Wars as just a setting, or is it a sort of genre unto itself? Is it this mix of sci-fi and fantasy or space opera? Is that what Star Wars is, or what it needs to be considered as such? Or is it maybe something else entirely that makes something Star Wars? Is there just something else about it, about either the way it tells stories or the way the stories feel or make us feel, something that's more intangible or difficult to pin down and explain or articulate, that makes something real Star Wars? And honestly here, I don't know that there's a correct answer to this question, because I think Star Wars is or means something different to everybody, which is absolutely fine, of course. And for a lot of people, or a lot of fans, they want to think of Star Wars or treat it as something that really happened, right? As this actual history of another galaxy, and that we're exploring it or discovering it, that with every new story we get, we unlock another piece of the puzzle to what that galaxy was, quote-unquote, really like. And in that case, for those fans, I'd certainly argue it's more of a setting than anything else, because virtually anything and everything that happens in that galaxy, even the most mundane of things or details, is part of that history and thus would be a part of Star Wars. And then, in theory, just about any type of story could be a Star Wars story, because the only qualification for it to be one is to be set in that galaxy. However, I also think there are plenty of fans out there, especially the more casual fan or the more average moviegoer who really likes Star Wars, who goes to it and watches it because of the style of stories it tends to tell, or because of the unique genre it's kind of created for itself. This, again, exciting blend of sci-fi and fantasy, with big action, lightsabers, and space battles, and the sweeping stories of good versus evil, or again, a space opera, right? They go to it or think of Star Wars as an epic 2-hour adventure in another galaxy that they just go home after, and that's about it. And for those fans, obviously there are just certain types of stories or content that likely aren't going to interest them or qualify as Star Wars in their mind. Because whereas the fan that treats Star Wars like a history would watch and probably really enjoy a 3-hour documentary-style movie about the different types of life forms on Tatooine, narrated by the great David Attenborough, of course, the fan who thinks of Star Wars as cool space movies with lightsabers is not even going to understand the point of something like that. Then there's also the type of fan that feels that, again, there's just something different or special that's difficult to articulate that makes something Star Wars, or doesn't make it Star Wars. That it's only supposed to do or deal with certain types of stories, or that certain things need to be in there or not in there. Otherwise, it doesn't count as real Star Wars. That it's perhaps, we could say, more about the themes than anything else, or the way it makes you feel, even. And yeah, for the record, I certainly think there's crossover here, or a blurring of the lines between these three kind of categories. I don't think every fan can be cleanly put into one of these three camps, or anything like that. I think we all fall into the spaces between the three, or more into one camp than the other two, perhaps. But I do believe these three qualifications, let's call them, are where the debates almost always lie when it comes to the argument over what is Star Wars. And so with that established, I feel like a lot of the people who don't like Andor, for example, that they reject it on the grounds of the second and third categories, not the first one. I think one of the main arguments against it, the one based on more of the second type of qualification, the genre one, is that it doesn't feel right because it doesn't have any of the usual kind of cool stuff, right? The Jedi and the lightsaber and all that. And then when it comes to the third one, it's also missing the intangible something that truly makes it Star Wars. And I do get those arguments. I don't exactly agree with them. I personally think Andor is some of the best Star Wars ever and one of the best shows ever, period. But I can understand why some people feel like it shouldn't qualify as Star Wars. And that's mainly because, or I think their argument is, that it's completely missing that mystical or fantasy element or feeling to it. You could argue there is nothing about it that makes it uniquely Star Wars, let's say, or that gives it that same sort of feeling you maybe get when watching the trilogy films, for example. Now, sure, it uses things like the Empire, Rebellion, familiar planets, characters, ships, and so on. It has all of these things that make it Star Wars in name, a ton of them actually, when you really stop and think about it. But all of those things could, in theory, be changed to different names or changed aesthetically a bit. And there'd be little or nothing left that makes this Star Wars. And again, as someone who absolutely loves Andor, I can't exactly argue against that. I do more or less agree that you could change all the names or the look of some of the things and put the show in another franchise or have it be the start of its own brand new franchise and it would work just fine. However, I don't necessarily see that as a negative, because there's this part of me that says it's nice to see something Star Wars just be fantastic in and of itself for a change. I mean, as much as I love all the lore and history, as much as a big part of me falls into that kind of that first category, right, that sees Star Wars as a setting, who likes to know all the details of the history of this real galaxy, even though I obviously know it's not real, it's just fun to play pretend, you could say. But as much as I love the lore and all that, I also hate to see how often it all gets used as this sort of crutch, you could call it. I hate getting Star Wars stories that are only good, or in some cases only kind of tolerable, if even that, because they're Star Wars, because they use all these names, places, and things that I am already familiar with, which oftentimes means they don't have to put the work in as storytellers, and they don't. They rely on my knowledge instead of actually building something. And so, in Andor, it was nice to see something use all of these things that, yes, I already know. All these things like familiar planets, characters, and so on that I have seen so many times before, but they also put the work in. They used them without relying on my knowledge of them to help sell the story. For example, I don't fear and hate the Empire in Andor because I know I'm supposed to fear and hate the Empire, because they're the bad guys that I have seen 1,000 times before in other stories, and I know all the horrible things that they have done. Instead, I feared and hated the Empire in Andor because the show itself gave me the reasons to fear and hate the Empire. They showed me their brutality and tyranny in a way I had never seen before. We got to see it on a more ground level, what the average person in the galaxy sees the Empire as, rather than the heroes of the galaxy, what they see it as. Furthermore, I wasn't just interested in Cassian Andor because he's this character from Rogue One, from a movie I really liked. I cared about him because he was a compelling and complicated character right in the story, and I didn't always know how to feel about him or the things he was doing. I wasn't fascinated, if not enthralled, by the story of Mon Mothma and her political dealings because she's eventually going to be the leader of the rebellion, and I saw her that one time in Return of the Jedi and I wanted a backstory. I was on the edge of my seat when she was on screen because this character, in the moment, in the show, here and now, and with her current situation, it kept me there. I need to know what becomes of her family, not for the sake of just knowing the history of Mon Mothma, but because I genuinely care, because the show made me care. Also, though, yes, you can absolutely argue the show is missing that fantasy feeling, and I will concede that. I will concede it doesn't necessarily feel like the rest of Star Wars. And I will also say that, no, I don't always want to see Star Wars used as a setting for more generic sci-fi. I do agree with you in that respect. Though at the same time, in a lot of ways, I do think this very much feels like Star Wars, more so than things that are trying to overtly look and feel like Star Wars. In fact, I'd argue few things have ever nailed the themes more than this show. It touches on everything from family to good versus evil and some of the things in between, to how our choices and our actions ripple out and affect not just ourselves, but everyone, even sometimes the galaxy around us. In this respect, it is one of the most Star Wars things I have ever seen. But for now, I think that's all I've got for you this time. I'm getting a bit off topic, and to maybe try to answer the question, and it's one aspect I didn't really talk about in the video, but if you're trying to make Star Wars, I think the first thing you got to do is try and respect Star Wars. That's what you got to do if you want to qualify as Star Wars. That's the one thing I think we can all pretty much agree on, whatever Star Wars is exactly, right? But anyway, if you want to ask a question for a future lightning response video, and I have been getting a ton of them lately, and I really have been meaning to do a more rapid fire response video to get to several questions. But anyway, if you want to ask a question for a future video, you just got to start your comment off with "Hey Thor" and then ask away. But whatever you choose to do, leave those comments below. Let's keep talking some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.